Okay, we're going to get started, everybody. Well, I just wanted to say a couple things about the Society for Conservation Biology and then introduce our tonight's presenter, Mike Phillips. Well, first of all, thanks everybody for coming for tonight's opening talk. It's actually our third annual research symposium of the Montana chapter of the Society for Conservation Biology. We are a global community of conservation professionals. We have more than 10,000 members around the globe who are dedicated to promoting the scientific study of the maintenance, loss, and restoration of biological diversity. The Montana chapter of the Society for Conservation Biology basically just has the same mission but focuses on our region and Montana. In the past, we have hosted regional meetings, commented on public policy, sponsored film and speaker events, as well as developed educational programs. And if any of you are interested in learning more about our local chapter, just check out our website by Googling Montana SCB or Montana Conservation Biology. Tonight's talk will be followed by a reception and a poster session just outside in the foyer. And tomorrow we have a full schedule of conservation talks planned on the third floor here at the UC. And we still have some spots available. The cost is $40 and $10 for students for a full day of talks, starting at 9 a.m. Finally, I'd like to thank our sponsors of the symposium, the University of Montana Wildlife Department, as well as the College of Forestry, so thank you to both of them. So now I'd like to introduce our speaker tonight, Representative Mike Phillips, who drove over from Bozeman. Mike received a bachelor's degree from the University of Illinois and a master's in wildlife from the University of Alaska. Upon completion of his master's, Mike served as a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service field coordinator for the red wolf recovery program, and he did this for 6 years. After that, he became the first project leader of the Yellowstone wolf reintroduction program until 1997, and then until this date, he's been the executive director of the Turner Endangered Species Fund. And as the director, he's been involved in dozens of restoration projects around the globe and currently sits on several boards as well as endangered species recovery teams. In 2006, Mike was elected to the Montana legislature, and here he founded the Montana Legislative Climate Change Caucus with the goal of conserving energy and reducing greenhouse gases in Montana. After being re-elected in 2008, Mike served on the House Energy Committee, where he continued his work on energy policy and climate change. Last fall, Mike was invited by the White House to join a coalition of 40 state legislators from around the country to work with the Obama administration and the U.S. Senate to pass a comprehensive clean energy and climate change legislation. Mike has also co-authored several articles in our journal, Conservation Biology, ranging on topics from red wolf reintroduction to reintroducing wolves in Colorado, as well as articles on the intent of the Endangered Species Act. And tonight, Mike is going to be talking about the politics of climate change. So would you all please welcome Representative Mike Phillips.
Well, that sounds awfully loud to me. Is it awfully loud to you guys? The TV guy just did something. Did you turn it down? No, okay, well, y'all can hear me, I hope. It's a treat to have an hour. I'll enjoy it. I hope you do as well. We don't often get an hour, and I won't use it all because questions and answers are a great way to learn a lot about each other and the topic at hand. I got to point out, you've got two of the finest members of the faculty here in the audience with me. They serve with me in Helena. Dick Barrett and Ron Erickson both are a lot of help in Helena. I get a chance to stand up here tonight and say some things, but the fact of the matter is there's a handful of us in Helena that work on this issue. And I'll make a big deal tonight of a bill that was passed in the last session that spoke to sequestering carbon for long periods of time underground, geologic sequestration. Had it not been for Senator Erickson helping pull the idea through the Montana Senate, I would never have gotten an opportunity to do anything. And so anyway, Ron, thank you. That was good fun. We got good work done. And so I'm not the only one here that can answer tough questions, so certainly bring it on. I am going to start by expressing disappointment about the president it seemed to me by all accounts the recent disaster in the Gulf should have been a watershed opportunity for green energy and climate change legislation. It should have been to climate change what 9/11 was to the Patriot Act, what the financial crisis was to the bailout of the banks. We know in this country that big disasters can drive sweeping legislation. I'll remind you back in 1969, an oil spill of just 100,000 acres, 100,000 barrels, just 2 days of the output of the BP gusher prompted then President Nixon to sign the Clean Air Act and initiate EPA. So the country has a history of responding to crises in important and big and sweeping ways. And yet when the President spoke from his Oval Office to lead the nation's response to the disaster, in my humble opinion, he absolutely failed to show up. He never mentioned, and I've got his speech. If you question this, here's his text. Here's the words of his speech. Never once in that speech can you find the word carbon. You can't find the word emissions, can't find the word greenhouse, can't find the word pollution. He only mentioned the word climate in a glancing reference to the energy and climate bill that the United States Senate was then considering. I think at best Obama failed to inspire and lead. At worst, he promoted the status quo with his lack of insight and his lack of sense of timing. In short, I think the President failed to capitalize on the crisis by using it as a flashpoint to drive the country forward toward a new energy future that would certainly improve national security, economic development and durability, and environmental integrity. And I'm going to say that phrase all night long, because that's just how big the issue is. I am by training a wildlife biologist that spent nearly the last 30 years working in the field of restoration ecology. I saw my first polar bear in the wild in 1982 for a period of time while waiting to establish my research camp in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. I had studying the impacts of oil and gas development on grizzly bears. I had the great opportunity to be stationed in the Eskimo village of Kaktovik. And I remember one day when a buzz went through the village because a polar bear had been seen feeding on a whale carcass about 100 yards offshore. The bear was big and white, as polar bears are, and when it turned around and I could see the left side of his rump, I saw the numbers 93. Old number 93, as he was known by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's Polar Bear Research Team, was well known to them not because he was an extraordinary bear, but because he had been an important part of a long-term study of the species ecology. Through those studies that have generated reliable knowledge about the species, we know a great deal about polar bears. They're absolutely fascinating animals that navigate, and this just absolutely fascinates me, and Joel Berger can appreciate this with your recent work on corridors and migration patterns, which speak to animals moving over tremendous distances. Well, polar bears navigate probably without air across a landscape that's forever changing because the sea ice floats on the sea. So at least when they're on the ice, no features are fixed in the environment. They keep moving around. And yet polar bears somehow know where they are. They're wildly successful predators. How else can you account for their large body size? They truly lead lives of magnitude in very harsh environments. And soon they'll be extinct because pack ice is disappearing at an alarming rate. The best estimates indicate that pack ice will be completely gone by 2020, 2030. Polar bear cubs are now being born smaller and with fewer litter mates than in the recent past. Adult body weights are decreasing. And most intriguing to me, now imagine a polar bear. This is an Arctic mammal. Its primary food is the ringed seal. They're good swimmers. They're outstanding swimmers. They probably float pretty well. Increasingly, polar bears are drowning. Now imagine that. Polar bears are drowning. And you know why they are drowning? They're drowning because they've got no ice to haul themselves out on to catch their breath. In light of these trends, the United States Fish and Wildlife Service at the tail end of the Bush administration listed polar bears as threatened under the Endangered Species Act. In the final analysis, the rationale for listing was habitat loss, a loss of sea ice because of climate change. Who would have thought that the ultimate canary in a coal mine would be the largest terrestrial carnivore in the far north? The science is clear. Climate change is real. The pace of change is quickening, and the effects are increasingly widespread and disastrous. From extinctions to persistent and deep droughts, to record-setting wildfire seasons, to insect outbreaks, to disruption of water supplies, to increasingly volatile and intense weather, there is no doubt that change is real, and it's becoming more widespread and increasingly disastrous. It's certain that Montana has not been, nor will it be, spared. The best data that can be assembled, and I must admit and give credit to your own Dr. Running, a Nobel laureate, Steve has also been a lot of help in Helena. And many of these Montana facts have been assembled by Dr. Running and his team. We know that throughout Montana over the last 30 years, average temperatures for March are now 6 to 7 degrees warmer, bringing about earlier snowmelt. We know that Montana is on schedule to face increasingly devastating droughts due to increased temperatures that are not offset by an increase, at least not a sufficient increase, in precipitation. So overall, everything gets more arid. We know that wildfires over 1,000 acres in size, these big fires, are more durable. They're more common now by 40% than compared to 30 years ago, in large part due to early snowmelt in the mid-level and high elevation forests. These fires are not driven by land management practices. They're in the forests that are typically not subjected to logging practices, for example. They're drier than they should be because the snow melted sooner than it should. We know that ag lands will become increasingly less productive. We know that, according to Dr. Running's best models, and they're good models, Missoula is not going to get any snow in 50 years. No snow in Missoula in 50 years. We know that in 50 years, Montana's coolest summers will be hotter than our hottest summers now. I could continue, but I think you get the point. Montana is ground zero for climate change. But here's the interesting point about that point. Everywhere, nearly everywhere in the world is ground zero for climate change. Given the fluid nature of the atmosphere and the interconnectedness of the biosphere, and the biosphere is fairly considered the global sum of all ecosystems. So given the fluid nature of the atmosphere and the interconnectedness of the biosphere, it does not matter one whit where a molecule of CO2 comes from. As far as climate change is concerned, all people are but bananas in a bunch. So we should be concerned about China. We should be concerned about India. This issue will, in Tom Friedman's words, flatten the world even more. Despite pressing urgency, climate change has been a very difficult issue for state and federal legislators. Now, before getting into the guts of that, it is fair to point out some progress has been made. Your own Senator John Tester, then State Senator John Tester, in 2005, shepherded Senate Bill 415, which requires that electricity produced in Montana, 15%, needs to be coming from renewables by 2015. That was a good bill by Senator Tester and everybody that voted for it. That's progress. It's progress that our governor formed a climate change advisory committee, although I haven't seen a whole lot of work from the committee's results. But nonetheless, it was a step. It was a step that we formed a climate change caucus in 2007. It was a step that in 2007 we passed House Bill 25. The Senate did as well, and the governor signed it. House Bill 25 was our attempt to respond to deregulation. That didn't work very well at all, and give Northwestern Energy more ability to begin to generate energy itself. But in the process of that bill, we said, okay, gee whiz, if you're going to do that, 50% of the CO2 from new plants has to be sequestered. That's a step. In 2009, Ron Erickson and I and others, working with Republican Senator Keith Bales, passed Senate Bill 498, which still stands as the nation's most sweeping legislation concerning geologic sequestration of carbon. And then, to be fair, our U.S. House of Representatives passed the Waxman-Markey bill, the American Clean Energy Security Act. That was good. The vote was 219 to 212. It was kind of a squeaker, but they got it done. So there's been some progress. But really, that's not the story. The story really is that we haven't been able to develop nor implement a roster of policies that will move this issue in the right direction. This comprehensive approach that's needed to build a new energy future. We haven't done that. As a matter of fact, I would argue we haven't even mustered the intellectual curiosity to have the requisite discussion to do the one thing that above all else we have to do. And if you take nothing from this talk but this one thing, please remember, at least in my opinion, the one thing we must do is put a price on carbon. At the end of the day, one way or another, we've got to put a price on carbon. Absent a price on carbon, the private capital needed to pay for the research and development and the infrastructure that will be required by a new energy future will remain sidelined or continually invested in the fossil fuel industry. One way or another, we've got to put a price on carbon. Just as an example, the three biggest investors in 2009 in renewables were the European Union, China, and South America. In 2009, those three governments, using mostly public money, invested $55 billion in renewable energies, the renewable energy industry. Well, gee whiz. The same year, 2009, just two private companies, admittedly big companies, ExxonMobil and Shell, invested $55 billion in oil and gas industries. We can't expect public money to do it all. There's not enough public money to do it all. And you won't see the private money coming into the new energy market without a price on carbon. Why has climate change been a tough issue for legislators? I have wrestled with this issue before I even got elected, and I have tried very hard to not seem overly partisan, while still developing an answer that I believe to be truthful. I kept, however, bumping into the very simple fact that in this country, politics matter. You know, recently, in the last few months, you could have passed sweeping federal legislation that would have ushered in a new energy future that improved national security, improved economic development and durability, and environmental integrity, if you could have convinced about 12 U.S. senators of the seriousness of the problem. You don't have to convince millions and millions and millions of people. You are about 12 senators short. In this country, politics matter. And because of that, climate change has been a difficult issue because quite simply too many Republican legislators do not consider greenhouse gases to be a problem. Before I provide a few examples to support the claim, I've got to point out for my own sense of well-being and fairness, I don't view myself as an overly partisan politician. I'm attracted to good ideas and I don't care much where they come from. I have voted contrary to the Democratic caucus. I was more than willing to sit down with Ron and Senator Bales and work on Senate Bill 498, even though I knew that the Republicans would probably claim some odd credit for it, as though it was their original idea, even though we had plowed all the ground and yet they got to harvest the fruit. But it didn't much matter. We needed to get the bill passed. I have stated repeatedly that restoring the confidence in the capacity of state and federal governments to do good work is tremendously important for the future of this country, and that is all made much easier when we recognize that we all benefit when the Republican Party performs well. I wish that Miss O'Donnell was not seen as a credible candidate in Delaware. I also recognize we all benefit when the Democratic Party performs well. I believe that the tension that's generated by top-notch competition between the two parties is essential to good and durable progress. We all benefit when all of our elected officials perform well. We all suffer when they perform poorly. Unfortunately, regarding climate change, too many Republican legislators have absolutely been missing in action. For example, in Montana, they've offered no substantive legislation to redress the problem, and they have stood in the way of good ideas that would have. They have introduced and passed bills that make absolutely no sense if you recognize the connection between healthy economies and healthy landscapes. Their go-to science guy is a veterinarian named Creighton Kearns out of Laurel, Montana. Creighton Kearns has written that this are his words, carbon dioxide emission as a cause of global climate warming is the biggest hoax of the last 30 years. He continues on his blog that his final analysis, climate change is part of a grand scheme launched by environmental extremists to drive you and your 300 mama cows off the home ranch and to relegate you the hard-working, God-fearing Montana rancher, to a 40-hour work week at the local Walmart. That's Kearns' analysis. He's their go-to science guy. During the beginning of the 2009 session, Republican Senator Jerry Black, the chairman of the Senate Energy Committee, stated, until there is verifiable scientific evidence that CO2 is the culprit, the committee feels that we should proceed with caution. This past spring, 17 Republican legislators, many of whom may serve in leadership positions during the 2011 session, endorsed the following statement. Rhetoric that mining coal will create global warming is just that, rhetoric. This past summer, according to Ron Erickson, who serves on our interim Energy Committee, two Republicans stated, one, man-made CO2 is insignificant compared to other sources. And then the second fellow stated there is no significant evidence that man-made gases are responsible for climate change. Last week, my opponent made the claim that the science is unsettled on the potential for CO2 to warm the planet. When I asked his campaign staffer to provide a list of articles that defined the rationale behind his claim, all I got was a mumbled and rather unintelligible response. Given my Republican colleagues' consistent criticism of the science, when you push on them, they'll say, well, gee whiz, Mike, the science is unsettled. And I can show you a long-winded email debate as we wrestled with the science, and I provided them access to the science, gave them PDFs of the science. I don't think they ever read them, but nonetheless, I was intrigued by their denial of the science. So the Climate Change Caucus invited Steve Running, Nobel scientist Steve Running, to come to Helena to give a brown bag seminar in the old Supreme Court chambers. Now this is a great room, very comfortable. We said to everybody, come, eat your lunch. You can eat your apples loudly. We don't care. But come and hear what Dr. Running has to say about the current state of climate science with a differential focus on the Northern Rocky Mountains. It wasn't an advocacy speech. Dr. Running was just talking about science. You would think that folks that were claiming the science was unreliable would show up. At that point in time, there were 75 Republicans in your legislature, if everybody here is a Montana resident, in the legislature. 3 showed up. 3 showed up. 1 left early. Dr. Running is an intriguing guy, very entertaining speaker. It wasn't a bad way to spend your lunch. Fast forward to the 2009 session. The Republicans invite the president of a coal company from Utah to come and speak about climate change. They showed up in force, filled the room. I went, I think Dick went, Ron probably went. It was interesting to hear what this guy had to say. I believe those kinds of people have to be at the table. But I wondered, my gosh, where were you just 18 months ago when you had access to a Nobel scientist? Nationwide, Republican state legislators also seem to struggle. I was given the great honor recently of being invited by the White House to serve with a small group of state legislators to work to help the United States Senate move this idea forward. Our big initiative was to develop a letter that would be signed by hopefully a whole bunch of state legislators as an expression of support to the U.S. Senate. So we developed this sign-on letter, and we worked hard to get signatures. At the end of the day, we enlisted 1,210 other state legislators to sign up. 29 Republicans, 2%. Now, I'm proud to say that of the 29, 2 came from Montana, and Senator Ryan Zinke from Whitefish and Senator John Brueggemann from Polson are due credit for recognizing that this very mildly worded letter had sufficient value for them to attach their names to it. Unfortunately, shortcomings are not simply apparent at the state level. There's plenty of resistance and plenty of inability to act. That's alive and well in the United States Congress. I mentioned earlier the House of Representatives did get the Waxman-Markey bill passed, but the Senate, the U.S. Senate, our Senate, failed miserably in its attempt to pass any comprehensive clean energy and climate change legislation. Indeed, I would have you believe that their behavior was even worse than just failing to pass legislation. This little story you should find stunning. They nearly voted to fundamentally deny the veracity of decades of science that affirms that increasing atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases are causing the Earth to warm, and that's causing the climate to change. They got real close to denying all that science, and here's how they did it. As it was apparent that momentum was being gained, the EPA got involved and looked at the science of climate change and came up with an endangerment finding. The EPA said, based on the science, greenhouse gases are harming human health, and therefore they can be managed under the Clean Air Act. In response to that, Senator Murkowski from Alaska developed, under a rather odd Senate rule, what's called a resolution of disapproval concerning EPA's endangerment finding, which, by the way, the EPA's finding was affirmed by the Supreme Court, that not only did they have the authority to review the science and reach a conclusion, but the conclusion that the Clean Air Act could be used to manage greenhouse gases was appropriate. So this EPA work was affirmed by the United States Senate. Murkowski said, well, that's not good enough. So she sharply contradicted the EPA and the Supreme Court with her resolution that would render moot the Supreme Court's finding and render useless EPA's finding that greenhouse gases are a problem and can be managed under the Clean Air Act. Here's where things get very interesting. The EPA's finding was not a political statement. When you read their endangerment rule, it's simply a review of the science. Itself is a scientific document. So any vote for Murkowski's resolution would have stood as a vote against the science, pure and simple. Murkowski's resolution didn't pose the question, should we respond to climate change? It didn't pose the question, how do we respond to climate change? Didn't respond to the question, who's responsible? It responded, or posed the question, is the science real, useful, important, reliable? The United States Senate got very, very close to passing that resolution. Curiously, reliable scientific data show that, as you would expect, Alaska is suffering obvious impacts from climate change. And in response to those impacts, you guys will love this, on the 14th of September 2007, then Governor Palin signed Administrative Order number 238 that called for the state to begin to proactively address climate change and begin measures to adapt. So Murkowski's own state recognizes climate change as real. If that's not sufficient irony, when pressed about the need for the resolution, the senator and her supporters indicated that, well, it was far better for the Congress, in our infinite wisdom, to develop specific legislation to redress climate change rather than to shoehorn the issue under the Clean Air Act. Of course, as would soon become apparent, this same roster of supporters stood in lockstep in opposition to the legislation to redress climate change. Fortunately, on June 10th of this year, the resolution failed on a vote of 47 to 53. You're pleased to know that Senators Tester and Baucus voted in opposition. And we know Republican candidates nationwide now commonly express uncertainty or outright opposition to the notion of climate change. Recent analyses indicate that the GOP is stampeding toward an absolute rejection of the notion and the science. I learned recently that Eileen Clausen, the president of the Pew Center on Global Climate Change, observed that although other parties worldwide may contain pockets of climate skepticism, there is, in her estimation, no party-wide view like the Republicans in our country anywhere else in the world that she is aware of. And yet it's clear the world's not going to move to redress climate change without our participation. You know, I find that poetically fair, given that we're differentially responsible for the problem, because we've been differentially responsible for the emissions over the last many decades, that we should also be differentially responsible for launching a solution. Unfortunately, we're running out of time for a solution. You can imagine, I don't have any graphs, but imagine there's a graph, and on our x-axis we have time, and the y-axis is rate of emissions. And the curve, the emissions curve is increasing and increasingly going straight up. So emissions are increasing over time. We got to take that curve and bend it. We got to flatten it. We got to reduce emissions and eventually then give it a negative slope and drive it down. That's terribly important. We've not done anything with the curve. Hell, it's going straight up now. So that's a big problem. At this point, at about 388 parts per million, increasing annually at about 2 or 3 parts per million, and that rate of increase is increasing, it's reasonable to expect by, 2030, we'll be at 450 parts per million. That suggests, the best science is that's sort of climate change light. Yeah, there are going to be some differences, but you will probably do okay. If things don't change, and the emissions rate in the curve now exceeds the worst case IPCC scenario, y'all know IPCC, worst case scenario, we're exceeding that, and it's likely now by about 2050, worldwide atmospheric concentrations of CO2 will begin to approach 550 parts per million. At that point, folks, all bets are off about what it will mean. Driving this is a persistent increase in energy consumption. I said if you don't remember anything, remember we need a price on carbon. The other thing, to get a sense of the gravity of the problem, be mindful energy consumption is increasing at an astronomical rate. Best estimates indicate that within the next couple of decades, there'll be a 40% increase in energy consumption worldwide as everybody gets better and better at adopting a U.S. standard of living. Everything is going in the wrong direction. And there's one other curve I'll speak to in a bit that's also going in the wrong direction. So why has it been difficult for legislators? Well, before I get there, I want to present a few facts, because in this debate, so many people confuse facts from opinions. And while everybody's entitled to an opinion, there's really only one set of facts. So here are some important facts to frame the issue. It's a fact that greenhouse gases are also known as trace gases because they constitute only about 3% of the atmosphere. They're rather uncommon, but this doesn't matter. Their uncommonness does not detract from their importance. Fact number 2, we've known for 150 years, this is basic chemistry, Ron can confirm, he was a chemistry teacher, basic chemistry, these greenhouse gases, because of their molecular structure, are very good at trapping long-wave radiation and remitting it back to the Earth. That's just basic chemistry. That's not hard science. We've known that since the late 1800s. That's fact number 2. You don't have to invoke a world of tough science to get this. Fact number 3. Well, without these trace gases and their abilities, the Earth's average temperature would be about 0 degrees Fahrenheit, rather than the very comfortable 59 degrees Fahrenheit. At 0 degrees Fahrenheit, life as we know it would not be possible on this planet. So these greenhouse gases are critically important. Fact number 3, since at least 1958, when David Keeling began taking measurements, CO2 levels have been rising. There's been no change in that line. They've been rising, and they are now higher than they've been for 450,000 years. Now think about that. To put that period of time in perspective, it's useful to remember we've been practicing agriculture for about 10,000 years. Before that, hunter-gatherer societies made a go of it for about 90,000 years. And before that, modern man began to evolve over the course of about 400,000 years. So quite simply, we're moving into a period of atmospheric concentrations that are unlike anything in our evolutionary history. That might prove to be a mighty big deal. Another fact, many things drive climate. Absolutely no doubt that clouds affect climate. Solar activity affects climate. Water vapor affects climate. The Milankovitch cycle affects climate. The Earth's orbit, its shape, the Earth's tilt, and how it wobbles. All of those things drive climate. But when you take all of those things into our best climate models and have the models predict what would have happened in the recent past, the prediction doesn't fit real data very well. You get a real nice fit between predictions from these models and real data if you integrate into your model greenhouse gases. That tightening fit by including greenhouse gases in your model strongly implies a causal relationship between temperature and greenhouse gases. So when somebody says, well, gee whiz, Mike, it's the sun, I say, you're right. They say it's clouds, you're right. It's water vapor, the most common greenhouse gas, you're right. But when you get right down to it, you can't get the models to fit real data. I'm not talking about projections out to 2100. I'm talking about real data from 1850 or 1702, real data. You don't get the fit until you include these greenhouse gases in your models. It's another fact that climatic patterns over the last 4 decades are different than they were 4 decades ago. Montana's warmer in the spring. That's just a fact. It's a fact that all of these predictive models are wrong. All models are wrong. Some are very, very instructive. And you know, all models are wrong because nobody can predict the future, but that doesn't mean they're not very, very instructive. So don't let somebody hoodwink you saying, well, all these models are wrong. Of course they are, but some are very, very instructive. It's a fact that the best models suggest increasingly dire conditions for Montana related to this increasing aridity that I spoke to earlier. Now I know this. Here's an interesting little story that says a great deal about my boss. We had a big meeting about 5 or 6 years ago, and out of the blue, Ted said, Mike, I want you to tell me where it's going to rain. I want to know where to buy ranches, so tell me where it's going to rain. So I became the official Turner Dowser. And in response to that assignment, I called guys like Steve Running and George Woodwell, another science giant in this whole work of climate change, and bumped into the best models, and I can explain what we mean by the best models, but the best models all indicate that continental centers, Montana, for example, are going to get warmer and drier. That's just a fact. It's a fact that we're not going to witness horrific catastrophes that can be clearly linked to climate change. No single weather event can be clearly linked to climate change. The problem is much more insidious and much more subtle than that. And the problem will be characterized by periods of normalcy that confuse the believers and fuel the critics. But we can speak of probabilities. We can't say for sure that Katrina was due to climate change. We can say that the probability of Katrina-like storms go way up. 100-year events become 25-year events with climate change. This is very important. It's a fact that the climate system is defined by a pronounced lag time. And it's because of the capacity of large bodies of water to store heat. About 90% of the heat that's been retained over the last many decades is stored in the oceans, just sitting there. Slowly, the oceans will release that heat that will affect climatic patterns over many decades, the weather events that we experience over many decades. There's not a doggone thing we can do about it. We will see certain weather events, we will see a certain climatic pattern over the next many decades because the oceans hold so much heat already. This lag time makes it very, very difficult for anybody to get their head around this problem. It's a fact that positive feedback systems, which are common in the climate system, are by the definition, they run amok. They feed themselves. A good example would be albedo. You can imagine in the Arctic, when you've got a lot of sea ice, it reflects the sunlight. But as a little bit of ice melts, the underlying water is dark, and so it absorbs heat. And as it absorbs heat, more ice melts. And as more ice melts, there's more dark water, absorbing more heat. And so more ice melts and more water, it runs amok. Positive feedback systems, by definition, run amok. And finally, it's a fact that climate doesn't equal weather. Climate does not equal weather. Weather is average climate. Mark Twain observed, climate is what you expect, weather is what you get. Weather and climate are very, very different. So with all of those facts, it's useful to provide a brief opinion, and then I'm going to get to these ideas about why this is so very difficult for legislators. I think it's widely believed that we've got to begin immediately reducing emissions so that by about 2050, we've reduced emissions to 80% below 1990 levels. This is believed to have the potential to stabilize atmospheric concentrations of CO2 at 350 parts per million. That's kind of the target. Unfortunately, as I described, the emissions curve is going up even more straight, as is the fossil fuel use curve, this increasing demand. And I said there's one other curve that combines these two to amplify the problem, which already has plenty of volume. And that's the curve of production of new conventional sources of fossil fuel. Peak oil, folks, is a big deal. The production curve, again, y-axis is production, new production, and the x-axis is time. If you look at the production curve for fossil fuels, it went up and it went up, and now it's tapered off. We have passed the point of peak oil. Well, with energy use going up, demand going up, what this will do is prompt energy companies to begin exploiting more marginal sources of fossil fuels, like the tar sands of Alberta. And what that means is you'll have more emissions per unit of energy realized. So I said all these curves are going, you've got the emissions curve going straight up, the use curve going straight up, the production curve going down. This is not a useful trend. And yet those are just the facts. We can't, that's just the facts. Okay, so why is it difficult for legislators? I think it's difficult because the vocabulary and the science and the policies of energy and climate change are complex and not easily understood by legislators. As an example, Senate Bill 498, your Montana Geologic Sequestration Bill, the bill that Ron and I worked with Senator Bales, it consisted of 30 pages of text, double-sided, small font, 30 pages of text that presented 11 sections of new law and extensive amendments to 4 titles, 5 chapters, and 20 parts of existing law. Additionally, the bill's passage required 52 amendments in the House Energy Committee. And Ron and I aren't done. We've got at least 2 more amendments we got to put on that bill to get it the way that we thought it should be back in 2009. I offer this as an example of the typical density that the legislation that will frame a new energy future probably will have. It's not easy stuff to get through. Legislators don't like to see bills that come to their desks that are that thick. They like one-page bills. Well, Senate Bill 498 was not a one-page bill. It's difficult because legislators who are in a position to solve the problem while it can still be solved won't enjoy the rewards. That's this lag time. There's nothing that I can do in January, February of 2011 that the benefits of which I'll ever see. Because I'm working toward a better future in 2050 because of this tremendous capacity of the oceans to hold heat. It's difficult because the scale of human activities that caused the problem defy understanding. This is important. How in the world can any legislator understand the number of internal combustion engines on the road every day, worldwide? How can a legislator appreciate the number of acres that are being cut down and burned to make the rainforest a bit more productive for 3 or 4 years because we want to eat a cheap hamburger? How in the world can a legislator appreciate the number of widgets that are made day after day, year after year across the world? The scale of human activities is monumental and very, very hard to appreciate. It's difficult because fossil fuels have done an outstanding job supporting human activities. Certainly in the recent past, everything you see here, everything is a product of fossil fuels. So it works. Why change the status quo when it works so very well? It's difficult because the scale of the problem, we spoke about the scale of activities. Well, the scale of the problem defies our understanding. You know, the biosphere seems to stretch on forever. Certainly across a space that's too big and too fluid for us to have ruined, or conversely across a space that's too big and too fluid for us to repair. It's difficult because Republican legislators, for the most part, and candidates, get confused by the piles of literature on the issue, because they don't seem to distinguish between several basic categories of literature. Not all information is created equal. They are, for example, seemingly unaware of the rigor that attends the assembly of peer-reviewed scientific articles. So consequently, lay and gray literature gets lumped with peer-reviewed publications, assuming that peer-reviewed publications get referred to at all, and then they're all afforded the same degree of respect. And yet we know that an article about energy policy and climate change that appears in the Missoulian is not assembled with the same scholarship as a similar article that would appear in the Journal of Conservation Biology. But newspaper articles count. They count to a lot of legislators. It's difficult because many state legislators who will acknowledge, you're going to love this, who will at least acknowledge there's a problem and acknowledge the ability of progressive energy policies to serve as a solution, will still resist action based on the belief that their state's contribution is so slight and the problem is so large that the need for federal action trumps the need for state action. What a cop-out that is. I'm not going to do anything because I can only do a little. You know, Montana accounts for 0.6% of the nation's greenhouse gas output. And yet my Republican colleague, gee whiz, Mike, we're decimal dust. What's the big deal? So you do nothing because you can only do a little? That's bullshit. Pardon my language. It's difficult because of needless partisanship. And there's a bunch of that. And know that I like competition. At one point, when I was 16 or 17, I was going to play professional baseball. So I like competition, but I don't like needless partisanship. And there's a lot of that. And there's a difference between partisanship, this tension I spoke of, both parties going at it to the best of their ability. That's good. But needless partisanship is just a waste of everybody's time. It's difficult because the design of our legislative process is far from ideal. It isolates knowledge, it isolates authority, it isolates influence, it perpetuates a herd mentality where everybody just kind of follows along. Certainly the case in Montana. Here's a little story. If you're sitting in our House chamber and you look to the front, there's two big scoreboards. And your name's up there, and there's a red light and there's a green light, and it shows how you vote. And when we vote, the chairman of the day will say, gee whiz, folks are going to vote. Does anybody want to change their vote? The clerk will record the votes. And that takes about 20 seconds. And as soon as you start pushing your button, your light pops up. So you can sit there and watch what everybody's doing. So if you don't have a clue what's going on, and you don't want to get isolated, you want to be in the Democratic crowd, you just kind of follow along. Now, when I first went to Helena, I desperately wanted to be on the tax committee because I don't know anything about taxes except they're important. And I thought at least there I'd learn. Speaker Sales didn't put me on tax, so you know what I did? The whole session, you know what I did? I followed Ron Erickson's light. Every tax bill, I don't have any idea what we're doing. But if Ron was red, I'm inclined to go red. If he's green, I'm going green. That's unacceptable. So here's my idea. Turn the board off. Force Mike Phillips to stand on his own 2 feet. Don't let me see what Representative Erickson is doing. At least force me to grab Ron and say, geez, Ron, we're going to vote on a tax bill in 5 minutes. Please give me a brief primer on this bill so I've got some idea what I'm doing. In D.C., it's even worse. Y'all know well, I believe the U.S. Senate has gone from being the world's most deliberative body to being a dysfunctional body. Do y'all know what a hold is? Now, this is your United States Senate. Do y'all know what a hold is? A hold, it's an informal procedure, nowhere mentioned in Senate rules, which, by the way, encompass 1,600 pages. Talk about a body that thinks they're more important than they actually are. They need 1,600 pages to define their rules. They've been doing this long enough. You think they could get it down pretty quick. Here's the basic things. But anyway, a hold. A hold is where an individual senator will notify the leadership that he or she intends to hold up a bill or a nomination by denying unanimous consent for the bill or nomination to go forward. The U.S. Senate's all about unanimous consent to get legislation moving forward. As I've come to find out, the hold was originally allowed as a courtesy, as a way to delay action so a senator could develop an argument or do some more due diligence. It arose in the days of horse travel, when senators had to get back to Washington and might need a little more time to review the legislation or develop questions for a nominee before they cast their vote. Well, you know, times change. I wouldn't be at all surprised if Senator Reid or Senator McConnell had never been on a horse, and I promise you they don't ride to work every day. And yet the hold is alive and well in the United States Senate. It's now simply a frequently practiced form of obstructionism, where a senator will hold things up to extract some favor or some benefit. Here's a classic example, and that it was presented anonymously seems poetically just as well. In 2003, 212 Air Force nominations were halted by an anonymous hold, and I'll explain that in a moment, which we learned later was an effort by Senator Larry Craig, who did other anonymous things, right? Right? Senator Larry Craig, because he wanted the Defense Department to station 4 new C-130 cargo planes in Idaho. So he's going to stop 212 Air Force promotions because he wants 4 planes in the state of Idaho. Holds can be placed openly or submitted anonymously. Get that? Anonymously. Nah, you're not telling people who you are. I'm going to muck up the works, but I'm not going to tell you who I are. You're going to love this now. This is our U.S. Senate, right? In 2007, they passed a bill that said holds that are secret can't extend for more than 6 days. Well, okay, that's a step in the right direction. But you know what they did? What they then did, they did to get around the ban. Now 2 or more senators will gang up and they'll pass the secret holds back and forth. It's now called a rolling hold. Right? Well, these guys probably have a secret handshake and a decoder ring. I mean, this is absolute bullshit that our U.S. Senate gets away with this. Right? At least make them be transparent. So you've got problems in Helena with the lights, for example. You've got problems in D.C. And these mechanical problems make climate change a very, very difficult issue. It's also difficult because of money. In a recent effort to consider climate change legislation, you're going to love these numbers, from January 2009 to June of 2010, the electrical utilities and the oil and gas industry spent $500 million lobbying against progress by the United States Senate. That's a lot of money. And you know what? They don't have to be right. They just have to confuse people. They cloud the issue. Y'all should read a book. One of the authors' name is Naomi Oreskes, University in California. It speaks to the capacity of big business to just cloud issues like the relationship between cancer and tobacco smoke and the relationship between greenhouse gases and climate change. It's a great book. I meant to bring it as an example, but I forgot it. But you could Google Oreskes and the book will pop right up. We know that big oil and coal, their contributions are tilted heavily toward Republicans, and the influence of money is only going to get worse. And this has relevance to Montana. It's only going to get worse because of the Citizens United versus the Federal Elections Commission, the recent ruling by the Supreme Court. In their infinite wisdom, now corporations can spend unlimited amounts of money on independent expenditures for or against candidates. If money didn't pollute politics before now, it certainly is on a track to do just exactly that. This ruling then led to a small group of litigants suing that Montana's law passed in 1912 called the Corporate Practices Act was itself unconstitutional. Judge Sherlock ruled in their favor, so that law now no longer applies. The Western Tradition Partnership was one of the litigants that was claiming our state law was unconstitutional, that said corporations have a limit on what they can spend. Now there is no limit. The president of Western Traditions Partnership said companies can now spend freely about radical environmentalist candidates and issues that threaten your right to earn a living. Imagine me against Northwestern Energy. I promise you they'd see me as a radical environmentalist. Or me against Rio Tinto, one of the biggest mining companies in the world. I can't win that fight. Here, the irony, late last night, I'm sitting there at my desk trying to figure out where $7.28 was because I was supposed to file my campaign finance report by 5 o'clock today, and I couldn't reconcile my books by $7.28. And I'm going to go against Northwestern Energy or Rio Tinto, and I'm worrying about $7.28. Gee whiz. Okay, what must we do to move everybody forward? And there are some things. I think we've got to recognize that a climate action plan, as manifest by a tapestry of related and comprehensive progressive energy policies, is the linchpin connecting all other significant issues in the 21st century. Security, the economy, and the environment are all connected by energy and climate change. I believe those are really the connective issues. If you can imagine your body includes a lot of connective tissue, well, these are the connective issues, energy and climate change of the 21st century. To do better, we've got to formulate a coherent and comprehensive plan for the United States that very quickly removes carbon from our energy system. This plan has got to cut through a bewildering array of policy choices that range from market-based solutions to our options to exercise the full police powers of the state to mandate changes. Regardless of what the specifics are, the final plan must join conservatives and progressives in ways that are transparent, pragmatic, fair, and long-lasting. Durability is important. It's not just good enough that we get it right on Monday. It's got to be right again on Tuesday. To do better, we've got to recognize that state policies have the potential to impact federal policies. When the California Assembly and Governor Schwarzenegger talk, the energy markets listen because they govern the world's 5th largest economy. When the Montana legislature and Governor Schweitzer talk, the energy markets listen because we govern a quarter of the nation's coal. That's a responsibility that we should not shirk. To do better, we've got to accept that we understand the underlying principles of climate change fairly well. The changes that are taking place around us are largely defined by somewhat simple and well understood chemical and physical laws and common sense. This is not hard science necessarily. We know warm water, for example, we know warm water occupies more space than cold water. That's true, and has a lot to do with these low-lying South Pacific island nations. Warm water occupies more space than cold water. We know warm water provides more energy for cyclones and hurricanes. We know that bright-colored surfaces reflect more than dark-colored surfaces. We know positive feedbacks run amok. We know that when you add CO2 to the oceans, the resultant chemical reaction creates carbonic acid. Carbonic acid causes the oceans to acidify. That increased acidification stresses coral reefs. When the reefs die, the wave action onshore intensifies. That's just good common sense. We know that alpine habitat specialists, of which we have many in Montana like the pika, and Arctic specialists like the polar bear are extremely sensitive to warm weather, and they've got nowhere to go. They're already at the top of the mountain, or they're already at the top or the bottom of the world. So these aren't tough ideas, really. I would have you believe, and it was Dr. Running that first presented this notion, it makes perfect sense to me, that we understand the processes that generate climate much better than we understand the processes that drive contemporary economies. And yet we place great faith in the predictive model of economists. Dick's an economist who placed great faith in the models of economists. And yet all models, I think all models, let's assume all economic models include a variable for the irrational behavior of consumers. I don't know of any climate model that would include an irrationality variable. To do better, we've got to, and in my mind, this is very, very important, and it gets back to this notion of pricing carbon. We've got to do a better job. We need a new means of accounting for all of the costs of production, distribution, and consumption. Quite simply, we need to consistently consider both positive and negative externalities. And very, very simply, an externality is something that's not part of the intimate transaction taking place at one time. A positive externality is when you benefit by something, but you don't have to pay for the benefit. You caught a break. You got a free lunch. Great. But a negative externality is when you get screwed in the transaction and you don't get paid. A classic example would be cancer derived from secondhand smoke. There might be some Americans say, look, I don't mind cancer. Give me cancer, but you got to pay me. Well, in a negative externality, you don't get paid. We've got to do a much better job accounting for these negative externalities. And a good way to start would be to consider the value of ecological economics, which is simply a subset of neoclassical economics, which takes into account, literally takes into account, the impact of our activities on the planet's living systems. And the fundamental notion of ecological economics is that human welfare so utterly depends on ecosystem services that we need to fastidiously account for any damage we do to those ecological systems that drive those services. We have to stop deeply discounting the future. Let's account for things today. To do better, we've got to rise above the divisions of right and left, liberal and conservative, and stake out higher common ground. You know, I believe when you get right down to it, everybody's an environmentalist. Everybody needs clean water, everybody needs clean food, everybody needs good, clean work. And in my mind, that's all it means to be an environmentalist, is to recognize that ultimately the bottom line is mostly the ability of green plants to take sunlight and turn that sunlight into some form of energy that we can use. To do better, we've got to restore the capacity of state and federal governments to do good work. Our neighbors have no faith in us as elected officials. To do better, we've got to improve our legislative procedures. I already spoke about the scoreboard and holds. We can't let that stuff go on. It doesn't serve anybody well. Accomplishing all of this is a very, very tall order. I understand it, but I believe very strongly it's an order that we must fill. At least senior members of both parties must master the science of climate change sufficiently to understand the stakes involved and summon the clarity of mind and depth of will to act wisely. And I've had a new idea. I told Dick I was going to mention a new idea tonight. He could call me, but you didn't. But anyway, it's the new idea tonight that will help state and state legislators anyway get their head around this problem. And it came to me in parts. The first part was I'm intrigued that we bring a Nobel scientist to Helena and my Republican colleagues that question science don't show up. That just kind of, I don't understand that. So I've been thinking about that a lot. And then I was instructed by an observation I had watching recent State of the Union addresses by presidents. And you know, there's a lot of partisanship that goes on there. People stand up and clap or they stay seated, and they do that on purpose, with the exception of two entities in the chamber. The Chief Justices never manifest emotion. The Joint Chiefs, the leaders of our military, never manifest any emotion. I was intrigued that the military just sits there. And finally, my thinking about how I can help state legislators understand the stakes involved was crystallized by the fact that it's become acutely obvious that all four branches of the military, as well as the National Security Agency and the CIA, are confronting now on a regular basis the life-threatening consequences of our energy policy and strict reliance on fossil fuels. That this is leading to a growing consensus within the national security community that climate change and our dependence on oil pose grave threats to national security. For example, the most recent Quadrennial Defense Review report, written every 4 years by the four branches of the military, kind of a summary It's presented to the Secretary of Defense, and in this case, Gates signed off on it. That report draws a clear connection between national security, climate change, and energy policy. Another example comes from April of 2010, when a large group of notable retired military officials held a press conference. For heaven's sakes, you got retired generals holding a press conference in D.C. to draw attention to the fact that oil money funds terrorism and that climate change causes regional instability in already unstable regions of the world. And if that's not enough, recently I learned that in June of 2010, Dennis McGinn, he's a retired Vice Admiral of the U.S. Navy, stated at a forum that American energy posture constitutes a serious and urgent threat to our national security, militarily, diplomatically, and economically. Further, this threat, this vulnerability, can be used by those who wish to do us harm. For all those reasons, it dawned on me, and here's the idea, Dick, and I need help. It dawned on me that we should invite a notable retired military figure to speak to a joint session, and Ron, you can help too because you're in the Senate, a joint session of the Montana legislature to talk about the relationship between national security and energy policy. They might choose not to show up for a brown bag seminar, but I can't imagine my Republican colleagues would turn their nose up at a retired four-star general that's going to speak to a joint session. I think there's value in that. I've talked to some Republican friends that might join us in inviting, and I've got some colleagues nationwide trying to find just the right person, because it would have to be a noble person, somebody that would fit the history of our chamber and our chamber's future. Not anybody can stand up there and deliver a talk to the joint session of Montana legislature. So it would be someone beyond reproach. If it works in Montana, I've got colleagues that would help me take this nationwide and try to present this same type of talk to legislatures around the country. I think there's value in that, in helping everybody recognize our back is literally against the wall. We have ample reason to believe that we only have, I spoke about this loss of time, only a few years, maybe a decade or two, to enact progressive energy policies before we're fully committed to notable climate-induced global changes that promise to be decidedly more negative than positive. You know, today, most of the world relies on fossil fuels not because they're better or cheaper than renewables, but because of past governmental policies and investment decisions. The status quo, hard to break, but it can be broken if we look forward and pass ambitious, forward-looking policies that drive demand for renewables. An important part of that, as I've said, is pricing carbon. Montana, and more generally the United States, can lead, and I would have you believe must lead. But for us to lead, Republicans and Democrats have got to come together on this issue. And then here's where things, at least for me, get very, very important. As we consider this coming together, it's useful to remember that we must recognize that climate change is all about continued isolation of wealth. That's really the nut here. And the undeniable relationship between wealth and your ability to respond to climate change, or any environmental disaster, or any social disaster. There's a good example comes from New Orleans. It's been said that wealth in New Orleans, wealth buys altitude. The highest ground, the ground least impacted by Katrina, is the highest ground. It's also the most expensive subdivision that's occupied nearly exclusively by whites. Wealth buys protection. We also must remember that climate change is insidious, it's subtle. There won't be these big catastrophes that we can say that's because of climate change. It's going to be much harder to pin down. Climate change will not destroy the earth, and it will not destroy humankind. If it were only that simple, maybe people would act. But ultimately, here's what it's about. It's about widening the gap between people who don't have and people that do. It's going to widen the gap between the haves and the have-nots. And it widens this gap, and here's where things get real interesting. As it widens the gap, it's going to increase the camp of those who don't have anything. It's going to increase the ranks of the poor and swell the ranks of the rich. Gap gets wider, big camp here, small camp there. And I believe that pattern will drive social unrest the likes of which the world has never seen. That, in my mind, is not a hopeful future for the nearly 2 billion people that already live on less than $2 American a day. And by no means should it be an acceptable vision for us. People that can realistically define the future through our actions today. Thank you for listening. That might have taken about an hour. I don't know. Joel's yawning. And I'm game for questions if y'all are. Joel.
Fascinating talk. Thank you very much. Question. You're in the legislature. You're in the major leagues. What advice do you give to a 21-year-old who's interested in wildlife, who recognizes the problems coming our way, and wants to make a difference 10 years down the road? What do you tell them that they should be doing? What should they study?
Wow. Economics. Oh, you're a college student interested in wildlife biology. You want to make a difference within a decade. What do you study today? Economics. Here's a story. My boss is an interesting fellow, has a great big appetite for lots of things. And Ted will, on occasion, call up with strange directives. I was the dowser for a while. We were working on the Hainan gibbon in China for a while and Tasmanian face cancer for a while. Anyway, Ted calls up one day and says, gee whiz, Mike, let's save the Amazon. That's important, right? Well, it's a pretty big job, Ted. And so with Ted, they're like 2-minute conversations, and you mostly listen, and he can't hear her well, so if you said something, he wouldn't hear you. And so the conversation ends. And I did absolutely nothing, because I thought, gee whiz, Ted. About a week later, Bo called. Bo's another one of members of my board and one of Ted's sons, and he said, geez, I heard Dad's sending us to the Amazon. When are we going? And I said, Bo, man. So I didn't do anything, because Bo forgets too sometimes. And then Ted called 2 weeks later and said, gee, how are we making on that Amazon initiative? I said, well, Ted, I'm looking into it. But didn't do anything, because I still thought it was just, there's an answer here, Joel. Here's the answer. I didn't do anything, but had he asked me one more time, here's what I would have recommended. Here's what I'd recommend to the young biologist. We would have gone to South America. We'd have found some top-flight academics, some top-flight conservationists that put their boots on the ground, and we would have helped them mainstream the notion of ecological economics so that forest has value in the marketplace as a living, breathing organism, rather than being cut down for a short period of time to graze a handful of cattle so you can kill them and make short-term money. I would strongly suggest that young biologists get their head around ecological economics and push that notion. Because if we can get the market more right, we can move these big problems in the right direction. And here's where it all begins to make sense. Everybody today lives in the marketplace. Joel, as a biologist, can appreciate you need food, cover, water, space. Everything needs food, cover, water, space. You buy it. You buy it in the marketplace. You buy food, you buy cover, you buy space. Food, cover, water, space, you buy. With the exception of the handful of hunter-gatherers that are alive today, everybody lives in the marketplace. Consequently, if we get the marketplace more right, if we get the price signals more right, if we're more willing to address perverse subsidies, but not throw subsidies out completely because some aren't perverse, we can do a better job moving these big issues. I would hope your department would start teaching a good course in ecological economics. That's what I would recommend. Yes?
While all these young folks are starting to learn economics, I would also hope that they would get back to the political arena in the kinds of numbers and activity levels that they demonstrated in 2008. Because I heard an interview with our Congressman, Dennis Rehberg, on our local station today, where he essentially denies that humans have anything to do with climate change. So I would hope that the young folks would really get active again in this election and let him know how you feel. Thank you.
I appreciate that, and as somebody who walks the neighborhood and knocks on doors, I appreciate help. And to an extent, all campaigns are about voter turnout, and young people can contribute. I appreciate that. I was assuming in Joel's question the person wanted to be a biologist, not a politician. I've actually concluded after having a little bit of time in Helena, it's a wonderful way to contribute. I would love to have been able to do it full-time, seriously, rather than as I almost, it feels like I'm dabbling in Helena, because I'm not a typical legislator in many respects. I've actually got a big family. I've got a 20-year-old in college and then a 20-month-old baby. So I get spread out in it's hard to do really good work when you're spread so thinly. But I think politics is a grand way to contribute. You don't have to be a bum to be a politician. And not all politicians are bums. Yes?
Two-part question and a comment. As a businessman, economist, expert in the energy industry, I hear very clearly what's being said, and I would ask everybody in the audience to consider that we're talking about the political realm, the legislative, but there's a responsibility of everybody in this room to understand their role in the energy chain, and that the greatest potential for change in energy consumption may come more locally and more individually, in addition to the legislative changes that are being proposed. It is something to consider, and there are, as I speak in high schools across the state, very important to reach our younger children and students to make sure that they understand in what capacity they fit into this role, because they don't. And the more we can help them understand that, the better decisions they can make, be they Republican or Democrat, because I doubt there's a Republican in the room here that would admit that tonight.
Well,
So,
and Bob, I don't disagree. However, I'm absolutely convinced that the problems are now so large and the time available to us is so short that we need decisions from on high, because I think, at least with Americans, and I don't profess to understand Australians or Spaniards or Frenchmen, but I have a good sense of my neighbors in this country. Most Americans just want to follow along. They don't want to lead. They don't want to get their hands dirty. They want to just follow along and do their own thing. So here's my point. If you get it right, you get 12 more senators, you pass legislation, and it filters down. People just are used to buying $4 gallon gas. And we've got to help them at the other end, because this new energy future will at first feel a bit uncomfortable. But we don't have time, I believe, any longer to try to build this from the bottom up only. We've got to have some top-down directives, largely built on the notion we've got to price carbon. Anyway, another...
second question, and I would respectfully disagree.
That's cool.
That's for a discussion. That picture behind you of the emissions coming out of those coal-fired plants, China is building and will have to build several hundred plants over the next several years just to meet minimum energy electrical requirements. You had mentioned earlier about we have to do something here, but it's been said by people who understand the problem that whatever we do here will not accomplish the objective unless there's cooperation from the Indias and Chinas of the world. And they have kept themselves outside of the agreements because they have said very clearly economically that is their number one priority. I have talked to Chinese officials who will tell you privately, on the scale of priorities, economic growth is their number one concern. So how does that fit into the equation of solving this problem?
Right, and Bob, I appreciate that. And China's probably building 2 coal strips a week. So, coal strips here in Montana, China builds 2 of those a week or thereabouts. 1 anyway, maybe 1.5, but they're really going. It would take us a heck of a long time to build another coal strip. They do it as a matter of weekly to-do list. You're going to need a raft of complementary policies. You're going to need the power, the police power of the state to mandate changes. And you can insist that certain other countries do certain things or we won't buy their products. And I would have you believe that China and India, at the end of the day, they want a habitable environment as well. And if you can build a new marketplace, the new energy future will represent one of the greatest, if not the greatest, business opportunity the world has ever seen. And so a raft of businessmen are going to chase, and businesswomen are going to chase that opportunity. But there's going to have to be some strong arming going on, but nothing will happen as long as this country chooses to not lead. And I would argue China and India's posture is largely defined by our lack of involvement and lack of leadership. And a lack of willingness to accept, gee whiz, the problem is mostly our making. We're the country that has led the way with emissions for so very long. And I've got a little kid and a bigger kid and kids in between. I don't let them get away with not cleaning up a mess they make. But this country's more than willing to walk away from a mess we made. That's unacceptable. We're better than that. Other questions? Yes.
You talked about putting a price on carbon, which arguably could save us and the world a lot of money in the long run, but that's hard to sell during a recession. What do you think our prospects are, or what do you think some of the best ways to convince people are that we could pass sweeping climate legislation while people still have this perception that we're going to be in a recession for a while?
Well, I think that the business opportunities that would result from a new relationship with carbon would do much to diminish the economic impact. And with more time, we can ask Dick later. I don't think the economic impacts are as grave as people have you to believe. Right. And we can build policies that allow for people to receive assistance to adjust their daily habits to this new energy future. And sometimes we do things that are uncomfortable at first because we know they have to be done. And I wouldn't try to convince necessarily the American public. I need 12 more senators. I need 12 more senators. I would have you believe if President Obama's team had said, Mr. President, the first thing we're going to do is hold the bums accountable. We're going to get Senator Baucus to hold hearings and find the bums that wrecked Wall Street. We're going to put somebody in jail. We should have done that. And then the next thing they should have done was energy and climate change legislation, because the president and the senators could have spoken each and every day about jobs, new good, durable jobs. I think that health care was a mistake. It was a strategic mistake to roll it out when they did. And I think it exhausted whatever political capital they had, and they got stuck. Other questions? Yes.
Two quick points. Three quick points. Mike Phillips, thank you for the hard work that you do. Zach Brown would be here, but he is feeding a lady dinner. So he says, thank you very much for doing your work.
Thank you.
Second, economics is a false dilemma. I think we should all be studying philosophy and logic to be able to solve these problems, but that's just a short jab in the back. Third point, why I have the microphone in my hand. Montana is a large state, same size as Germany and 84th of the population. So my question is how do you frame these debates so that it's not a partisan issue, it's just a Montana issue? So specifically, how do you combat the Ken Champions and the Scott Sales to be on your side, I guess?
Yeah, sure. Scott Sales will never be on my side. So I don't worry about Scott Sales. I respect his right to have an opinion that's vastly different than mine. I don't respect his diligence nor his scholarship. But nonetheless, he's not one of my more favorite legislators. But there are 15 or 20 Republicans who I have a great deal of respect for. And I think if there were ways that all of us had to more typically stand on our own 2 feet, that they didn't feel as though they had to hide within the caucus, they would be more inclined to follow what they thought was a good idea, even though it might not be what some members of their party are doing. For example, when I was interviewed by the Bozeman Daily Chronicle through their endorsement process, they said, you know, Mike, why is Helena so hyper-partisan? Do y'all woodshed people? Does the Democratic leadership team take people to the woodshed and insist that they vote a certain way? Do the Republicans do the same? And I said, well, I don't know what the Republicans do. You got to ask them. But the Democratic caucus doesn't do that. We don't woodshed anybody. So that doesn't drive hyperpartisanship. What drives hyperpartisanship in your state legislature is ignorance. Ignorance. And you know what drives ignorance? Certainty. Absolute certainty drives ignorance. I'm sitting in the House chamber one Saturday, largely all by myself, and Scott Sales comes up. This is the truth. I'm not digging on Scott, but nonetheless, and he sits down. I think, holy mackerel. We don't get along very well, but so he starts holding forth. And he says, you know, Mike, you know why I vote no on all the bills? I don't understand it. Wow, okay. That's not much better. I follow Ron's lead. So, you know, okay, well, here's the point. You can fix that. Limit the number of bills that we introduce. You know, when we get into the session in January, February, we'll be wading through 1,500 bills. Maybe 1,800, maybe, but a whole bunch of bills. Montana doesn't need 1,500 new bills to make the state a better place. It's crazy. Legislators go up there and they think, well, gee whiz, I'm here as a lawmaker, I got to make laws. I know Democrats that will campaign on the notion, I was the one that passed more bills than anybody else, so I'm good, send me back. Assuming that that's the only measure of success, of passing bills. Well, there's all kinds of ways one can contribute. So here's what we do. To make it easy for everybody to rally around good ideas, limit the number of bills so people routinely will be able to distinguish between quality of work versus quantity. You know, your legislators will go to Helena, and during the first month, they'll say things like, gee whiz, I got here early yesterday and went home late. I'm here early this morning. I'm going to go home late. This is a lot of hard work. It's like drinking water from a fire hose. And they say that with pride. They should be ashamed of that. You cannot drink water from a fire hose. It's impossible. It's a bad design. It's a design that easily allows you to distinguish, or fails to distinguish between quantity of work and quality. So I believe we could do a much better job if people had more time to reflect on the big issues that were before them, not 1,500 bills that at the end of the day, many don't make a whit of difference. So there are ways that we can allow people to find the best idea, but our system is not designed to do that very well. And yet when I proposed, I worked like a dog to get on the Legislative Council. The Legislative Council is an interim committee that meets between sessions that oversees the work of the legislature. It's typically the senior members of the leadership team. I wanted on the council, not because I care about how the space in the Capitol building is allocated, which we spent a lot of time wondering about, but because I wanted to have ground level access to proposing changes to our rules so that we might turn the board off. Here's a rule you guys might love. You know you don't have to be present to vote. All of the real hard work that the legislature does is done in a committee. A committee is where experts testify for or against a bill. A committee is where you can ask questions of experts and ask questions of your committee members. And you as a committee decide whether the bill goes to the House floor or to the Senate floor. There's no real good work done on the floors. For heaven's sakes, the people there don't know much. And yet you don't have to be present to vote in committee. When I was a rookie, I go to my first committee, and guess who my seatmate is? Scott Sales, Speaker of the House. I thought, wow, I'm going to learn something. This guy sees the world very differently than me, and he's the Speaker of the House. This is great. He never showed up. Never showed up. For all intent and purposes, never showed up. Never missed a vote. Never showed up. That's unacceptable. You got to stop those kind of things if you want people to follow the best idea. Because right now everybody hides. Myself included. We hide.
Why is that allowed?
Why is
Why is it allowed? What's the
because people don't.
scared?
Yeah, they don't do hard work. I got elected, man. Come on, dude. I'm going to go eat chicken wings and celery sticks, and people think I'm important. We eat a lot of chicken wings and celery sticks. You know, they're mostly chicken wings and celery sticks. They don't want to do the hard work. You think because people get elected, they're somehow special? And you know what? I appreciate that. And a lot of people really are. But there aren't that many really talented people in the world. There just aren't. But we can insist that they do a better job by changing the rules. But nobody even pays attention to the rules. Again, dinging on Speaker Sales. Toward the end of the 2007 session, we had this interesting debate going on the House floor that largely revolved around rules. And he stands up and says, you know what? I don't care what you do. Throw the rules book out. I'm going to vote against the bill anyway. So I don't mind that he votes against the bill. But the Speaker of the House should protect the integrity of the process. He said, I don't care about the rules. And I don't know why people are the way they are. I was able to get very few rule changes past the Legislative Council. They've always got some reason why, oh, well, gee whiz, Mike, you don't know enough yet. But I may yet have opportunities. If I get some help from colleagues, I may yet have opportunities to see how things could be different. And maybe they'll be worse, but at least we should try to make them better. I need help on that, Mike. Other questions? I know y'all have been sitting for a long time, and I appreciate that. Anything else? Well, thank you so very much. I enjoyed myself.